I went to a high school in Budapest, in Hungary, which specialized in math. And by the end of it, at around the age of 17, I figured that I wanted to, I didn't want to become a mathematician because I was not good enough in math for that. But I figured I might still be good enough to be someone who applies math to understand real world questions. And so after a brief hesitation in between economics and neuroscience, neither of which I knew anything about, I figured that the brain would be the most interesting thing to work on. So I figured that I wanted to build mathematical models of the brain. Obviously completely unaware that such a field had existed actually already. So with all the arrogance of an 18-year-old, at the end of high school, I decided that I knew whatever there was to be known about mathematics. So it was time for me to learn about the brain, if I wanted to build mathematical models of the brain. And with that, I started a course in biology, which was a huge mistake, not because biology is a lesser subject, but it didn't really fit me because there was a lot of things that required rote learning and memorization, which are really not my thing. And there was very little, for my taste at least, there was very little kind of formal thinking. But by the time I realized this, it was kind of too late. And I was also too shy to switch fields. And also, at the time in Hungary, the university system wasn't structured in a way that would have made such a switch easy, unlike in Cambridge, for example, where if you come in, you start as a natural sciences student, and you have a couple of years before you need to decide which natural science exactly you want to study, which I think is a fantastic thing. We didn't have that back in Hungary. You started a 5-year course. So there wasn't a BA in between. You went straight for a master's for 5 years. And so there I was stuck with my biology degree. So I actually interrupted it a couple of times because I hated it so much, so that I had time for other things that I liked more. And in fact, the first time I interrupted, I used that year, among other things, to only go to lectures that were actually interesting for me. Which I'm sorry to say, didn't include things like plant taxonomy and things like that. And so one of the, quite accidentally, I saw a notice on the wall, on one of the walls of the university, in one of the kind of the hidden corridors, that said that there was going to be kind of a optional course about mathematical models of the brain, which sounded like someone has come up with this idea that I thought I had. So I went to this course, and this course was given by a person who at the time was the only computational neuroscientist in the country, Peter Erdy. So I went to the course, I joined his lab, and this was still when I wasn't even in my second year of undergrad. So I kind of started it relatively early. And I stuck with it. There was moments when I was wavering between becoming a computational neuroscientist and the theater director. But in the end, I stuck with computational neuroscience, and I've been here ever since. Yeah, that's my story. That's how I became a computational neuroscientist. And yeah, so from there, I even stayed there for a PhD in the same lab and the same university, which I would probably not recommend for people because I think it's actually useful to move somewhere else and discover new places and learn about other things. And then for a postdoc, I went to the Gatsby. I worked with Peter Dayan there for 3 years. And then after that, I got my position in Cambridge. And in the meantime, my family decided that they wanted to move back to Budapest. So they did. And so now I'm kind of sharing my time between these two universities. There's a cognitive science department in Budapest with which I'm affiliated. So that's it. That's my story. Any questions so far? We can probably discuss those in the break. All right. So what I'm going to, so first of all, A, I have a tendency to overrun with time. B, I have 3 lectures to give in the space of 1. So that's not a very good omen. And so I also tend to speak fast, even faster than how I'm speaking now. But there's no point in me trying to cover an impossible amount of stuff with you completely being lost after slide number 2. So what I would like you to do is to interrupt and ask questions absolutely anytime. That's the point of this course. It's not meant to be about me kind of preaching about the newest and the greatest. It's about you learning, and you will only learn if you ask questions. There's actually a theory about how asking the right questions facilitates learning. That's something that I will probably not have time to talk about, but it's intimately related to topics that I will talk about today, and it can be given a nice Bayesian formulation in case you're interested. Okay, but right now you should be practicing this rather than thinking about the theory of active learning, and active learning requires you to be active and ask questions. All right, so the three topics that I could cover, the three big topics are, here's the first one, Bayesian models of perception, cognition, and learning. And this is still just topic number one. So it's not because perception is one, cognition is two, and learning is three. It's all just in topic one. Then in topic two, I could talk about the neural underpinnings of Bayesian forms of perception, cognition, and learning. So the first part will not mention neurons at all. And then the second part could talk about time permitting and interest being there in the audience, could talk about how we think about neural implementations of these models. And then the third part is kind of using Bayesian ideas to study a very different level of organization of the nervous system, which is really at kind of the biophysical and circuit level organization of the nervous system. So it turns out that the same very basic principles that underlie why a lot of people work on these models apply just as well to this very different level of organization, and can actually give us, I think, very cool insights into how and why neural circuits are structured in the way they are. So that's kind of the menu. And as we will be running out of time, I'm sure, at some point you'll have to make choices. One choice is that we just kind of move some of the parts of my talks to the afternoon, if you're interested, because as I understand, the afternoon is kind of reserved for optional tutorials, so we can regard some of this as an optional tutorial of that sort. Okay, so that was the disclaimer. So this is the first part. And just, can I have a quick show of hands? How many of you work on behavior? Ah, that's quite a lot. How many of you work on behavior only? Okay, so that was one, maybe two people. The two people I actually know very well, either from Cambridge or CEU. So I guess I should really motivate why, in this first part, I will only be essentially talking about behavior. And my very easy and simple motivation for that is that behavior is interesting, complicated, and non-trivial. So it turns out, you must have heard already about bottom-up versus top-down approaches to computational neuroscience, I assume. Yeah. Okay? Yes? I really shouldn't be looking at the faculty. I should be looking at you, because even if they told you about it, but you don't remember, that's of no use. Do you guys know about bottom-up versus top-down? Kind of. Okay, good. So I think studying behavior honestly is important, because it really, if you start bottom-up, which I think is a very useful way to start, and I'm by no way committed to either top-down or bottom-up, even if most of the time I'm doing top-down. You can come up with kind of neural circuits that solve tasks, but often what I find, both in my own work and in other people's work, is that the solutions that those networks present to kind of computational tasks often fall far behind of the ways biological organisms solve those tasks. And so looking at behavior is important, because even if you're only interested in neural circuits, learning about behavior is important because it gives you a bar, right? If you're thinking about a neural circuit and how that neural circuit might solve a task, understanding behavior gives you a bar that you know you will have to pass. I need to be able to solve with my neural circuit, I need to be able to solve that task at least as well as the organism's behavior shows they can solve it. And it turns out that if you don't do that, you can often stop with a solution that you think is right, but turns out to be much, much worse than what the actual behavior shows. So there's a lot of ways in which our behavior, our collective us, including all sorts of animals, our behavior in a lot of situations is surprisingly sophisticated. No question we can also be kind of impressively dumb in many situations. But at least if you test animals in the right way, it turns out that their behavior is surprisingly sophisticated. So I think that whatever you do in neuroscience, you should keep that in mind, that even if you are looking at the level of molecules and the subcellular components, and for example, you're interested in how this and that molecule or this and that subcellular component is related to learning, you really shouldn't have a too simplistic notion of learning, because that simplistic notion of learning doesn't, we don't see that in behavior in many cases. It turns out that the way organisms learn is impressively sophisticated. But in order to be able to make that claim at all, that it's sophisticated, we need to be able to define what we mean by sophistication, and in any case, we need to be able to define what would be the right, a normatively right way of learning. So much of what I'm going to talk about today is going to be exactly about that. So I will introduce formal theories of learning that in some way are kind of optimal, and then I will show cases when humans at least come kind of close to that optimum. And I guess I will not be talking about animals this time, but there is kind of similar work in many domains with animals too. Okay, so that was my kind of 5 minutes to try to convince you that you should not switch off right now, even if you are kind of a neurocircuit or single cell person. Okay. So a central concept that I will be talking about here is internal models. And internal models really underlie a lot of our behavior and a lot of cognition. Really, okay, I need to put this here. Will this work? Will this work? No, it still doesn't work. Okay, so this is the dictionary definition of internal models. Internal models are a mental representation of the surrounding world. I guess this definition applies most naturally to humans, but really, as long as you're happy attributing a mental life to animals, which I think you should be, then it also applies to animals. And so internal models are really kind of pervasive. They are in all walks of cognition. They are fundamental. This is one of my favorite examples, a very kind of famous one. How our knowledge of the physical processes of the world that interact, in this case between the convexity of a shape and the position of a lighting source, determine how we see shadows and shading in the world, right? So you look at this image and immediately, even though you can't come here and touch it, and even if you could, there would be nothing here but a two-dimensional screen. Just by looking at this image, you can infer that there's a three-dimensional structure here, and with high level of certainty, most of you would think that this is a convex rather than a concave shape, and the lighting is coming from here. None of that information is directly available to you, right? We don't see the lighting source, and you can't come here and touch the three-dimensional properties of this object. But we have an internal model of which we are not even aware necessarily, that tells us how these causes interact to create these observations, and then we can invert this and kind of reason about the underlying causes given these observations. And so the first thing I will do today is to explain kind of what's the mathematical calculus that we can use to kind of formalize this notion of an internal model and how we can invert an internal model to go from observations back to causes. At the other end of the spectrum, action. So it's very well known in motor control that we have internal models that predict the outcomes of our movements, for example, which help us kind of control our movements much more finely than we would be able to without such internal models. There's a lot of cool work that demonstrates these internal models in very kind of in ways that are accessible to our everyday experience, but also you can properly study them quantitatively, and there's a lot of cool work about understanding how internal models of our own motor system work, and how they are shaped, for example, during learning. But you can go all the way up to very high-level cognition. So this is kind of another axis here. This is the sensation versus action axis. This is low-level versus high-level. And we see properties of animals, and from that, we build an internal model of how these animals are related to each other. And again, such an internal model then helps us predict properties of animals that we haven't quite observed yet, for example. So if you hear about a furry animal that has 4 legs, then you will already predict that it probably, has offsprings that it will feed with its milk and some other basic properties. And then, of course, one of the best known examples is that of navigation, where this internal model is called a cognitive map. We are good or bad in this to different degrees. But to some degree, all of us can, for example, by now, I guess you can imagine a cognitive map of at least this floor of this building. The building itself is pretty big and labyrinthine, I guess. But at least this floor you can imagine. And you can imagine how you would walk from here to the cafeteria without actually doing it. And so these cognitive maps, again, have been the target of a lot of interesting behavioral as well as neural studies, including some Nobel Prizes awarded a couple of years ago. So these are all internal models, and they come up with in all domains of cognition. And what I would like to do now is to kind of bring in a mathematical framework in which we can think about how these internal models are defined, how they can be used to infer quantities that we can't observe directly, and how they can be learned from experience. And it turns out that all that in one shot almost can be done with the same very simple mathematical tools of probability theory, really. Okay, so we essentially need to add one component to this, which is probability theory. And so internal models that are formalized in the language of probability theory are called sometimes probabilistic models. And I will use this kind of example here to explain what I mean by that. So it's a very old idea in neuroscience and even in philosophy that our perception is not veridical. And if you've ever taken any kind of psychology, neuroscience, or cognitive science introductory course, kind of Psychology 101, then you will know that our percepts are not veridical. Our percepts are constructed based on some observations that we make. And so Hermann von Helmholtz was one of the people who really realized this and went after this idea and formalized and kind of articulated this notion by saying that perception is unconscious inference. So we are inferring things even if we are not aware that what we are doing is inference rather than veridical sensation. And I would like to add to that so is memory, learning, and almost anything in cognition can be thought about as unconscious inference. And I have a couple of cool demos that we can do afterwards, maybe, to, for example, show how memory, which we like to think about as something that is as veridical as it can be, is a very much inference-driven process. Okay, but going back to this example here, and most of my examples will be from the domain of perception, because that's kind of the most directly accessible domain. So here, the way obviously this can be formalized in many different ways. I wanted to keep it simple. So here, I formalized the internal model that underlies the way we are perceiving this image here as there being two causes, or two unobserved or latent variables. I'll use these terms kind of interchangeably, that give rise. Together, they determine our observed variables, so shading and shadow in this case. So the shading is, that this object appears light here and dark here, and the shadow is that it's casting a shadow over here. And so to start formalizing this, I'm going to start introducing variable names. So the observed variables I'm going to call x's, x1 and x2. The hidden variables I'm going to call y1 and y2. And so the idea here is that we have a way of describing how y1 and y2 interact to produce x1 and x2. But in the end, what we need to do during perception is to go back from x1 and x2 and infer, or in some way maybe estimate y1 and y2. So how do we do that? And here, Jim Morrison comes to the rescue, who famously said that there are things known. There you go. Those are the observed variables, obviously. There are things unknown, hidden variables, and between them, there are the doors of perception. Actually, it wasn't even Jim Morrison, it was Aldous Huxley who first said this. And, giving credit where credit is used important in science. So I figured I should add Huxley here. And they were both right, but not quite right, almost right. Because really what's between things known and things unknown is the rules of probability. And the rules of probability are simple. There's only two of them that you will ever need to know about, at least for the purposes of my talks. There's the product and the sum rule. So the product rule looks like this. And now what I would like to see is who are the people in the room to whom this doesn't ring a bell? Just so that I know at what level I should be explaining. Was this covered already?
I'll ask the other way around.
Okay, who are the people who know what this means, what this notation means? Cool, everyone, almost, except for, okay. Okay, so, Jakob, you should probably discuss this. Okay, and you will immediately recognize that the product rule can be rearranged to give us something that we know and love as Bayes' rule. And so there's nothing specific about Bayes' rule, it's just a rewriting of the product rule. And so it is really this rule that allows us to invert our internal models, right? Because our internal models tell us how we think observations are derived from hidden causes. And it's a probability distribution because in principle, this relationship between hidden causes and observed variables might be stochastic, either because the world is really physically stochastic, or because there is some other, or maybe it's deterministic, but deterministic given a bunch of other things that we don't care about right now, and we are marginalizing them out, which I will explain in the next moment, what I mean by that. So for all practical purposes, most of the time, this might be actually a stochastic relationship. But what we want in perception is to go back. We are given some x1 and x2 and want to know about y1 and y2, right? You see this image, you see the shading and the shadow, and based on that, you want to be able to infer where is the position of the lighting source and whether the shape is a bubble or a dimple, convex or concave. And Bayes' rule tells you exactly how to do that, right? And I'm not going to explain this to you because you already know. You take the likelihood, which is this piece that connects the hiddens to the observed variables. You multiply it with the prior, and normalize appropriately, and you're done. Okay. The other rule, and by the way, just a reminder, a special case of this is when the joint factorizes into the product of the marginals, but don't forget that that's not true generally. It's only true if and only if the x and y are independent, right? So do not make this mistake ever to automatically assume that the joint distribution of two variables factorizes into the product of the marginals. The other rule is the sum rule, also known as marginalization. And it just says that if I know the joint distribution of two variables, I can compute the marginal distribution of any one. Or if I have the joint distribution of many variables, I can compute the distribution of any subset of them by summing over the values of all the other variables that I'm not interested in. And that means the product and the sum rule together means that, can I start erasing the whiteboards? Yep. I have a bunch of exercises that I sent Jakob yesterday, and I believe they will be, or they are probably already online. This is an exercise that is not included in there, although I probably should have included it. But I just want to point out that once you know the joint distribution of any number of variables, x1 to xn, you can use the product and the sum rule to compute any distribution of those variables of interest. So xi, xj, maybe xi1 to xin. This is a different n, given x I n plus 1 to xi k. So if I have a bunch of variables and I know their joint distribution, I can compute the conditional distribution of any of them given any other subset of variables. And all I need to know is the product of the sum rule. And so an exercise would be, for example, that given 4 variables, x1 to x4, compute, any possible, so if you know the joint, compute any possible distribution, for example, x1 given x2 and x3, or x1 and x2 given x4. The bottom line, the practical advice that follows from this is that whenever you have a complicated looking probabilistic inference problem, the first thing you want to achieve is that you want to know the joint distribution of everything. And once you know the joint distribution of everything, from that you can compute the distribution of anything conditioned on anything else. And that's the safest route, because otherwise one can get easily lost how to compute the distribution of one variable given some other variables. But if you go through the full joint, you can't get it wrong, in principle. You can always get it wrong. But really at that point, you just need to kind of mechanistically apply these rules and you're done. Okay, so what Bayes' rule gives us, together with the marginalization rule, is that we can invert these arrows and go back from observed variables to hidden variables. And so that's great, because now I can take in observations, and in some sense, I have an optimal calculus. And if you want, we can discuss later in what way I mean optimal here, but there is actually a notion of optimality. There's an optimal calculus that tells me how to reason about unobserved quantities. But notice that the outcome of that is not, in general, a single setting of y1 and y2, even though the way I was describing this example is that, well, it's obviously lighting is over there, and it's a convex rather than a concave shape. But in general, and that's because it's hard to communicate probability distributions, right? We are pretty bad. Human language is pretty bad at that. And there's a lot of consequences of that too. But in principle, the outcome of probabilistic inference is not a single estimate of the hidden variables. It's a distribution over those hidden variables, right? And high-dimensional distributions are complex beasts. And they're hard to represent. They're hard to compute with. And most importantly, at the end of the day, in a biological setting, we need to emit actions. So just like human communication doesn't really allow us to communicate distributions, at any one time, with some simplification at least, we can only take one action. So we have to somehow commit to a single output, right? I might have some uncertainty about, if there's fire in the building, I might have some uncertainty as to whether it's best to leave this room through that door or through that door, but in the end, I'll have to choose one. I can't leave through both doors, unless I'm a photon, I guess. So our actions require us to commit ourselves to a single course of to a single course of action. And so we need one additional piece of theory that tells us how to go from these beautiful full probability distributions that in principle we are inferring all the time, if you believe that, to single to single actions or single estimates. And so that, something is wrong with the other, can we somehow lower the projector?
No.
Is there, no?
No. You should lower your slides.
No. Okay, so it reads Bayesian decision theory. Okay, so that's the additional piece of theory that we need. And that's kind of the theory of how to emit single actions, or as a special case, as you will see, how to make point estimates. And the additional piece of the additional mathematical object that we will need is something that we call a loss function, or a cost function, or a utility function, if you are more of an optimistic kind. If you like to define the world in terms of rewards rather than losses, here I'm showing the Hungarian way, which is defining it in terms of losses. And so what a loss function is that it's a function of two things. It's a function of the true state of the world, and I am, for once at least, using consistent notation. So y here, just as was on the previous slide, it's a hidden state of the world. It's a hidden variable. Those are, I'm not quite consistent. That would be surprising if I was, because these are not different hidden variables. These are different settings of the same hidden variable or the same hidden variables. So these are different values that a hidden variable can take. Okay? So these are different states that the world can be in, different settings of the hidden variables, and these are different actions that I can choose from. And the loss function tells me that if the world is in state number 2, and you emit action number 3, the loss you will suffer is such and such. Okay? So it's a big lookup table. You can think about it as a big lookup table. Of course, it can be continuous, doesn't need to be discrete, it can be infinite rather than finite, but this is the basic concept. So here's a very, very simple question, just to make sure you're awake. If I know that the state of the world is y2, how should I choose my action? What's that?
Minimize the loss over A2.
Right. So I look up the column that corresponds to y2, and I minimize the loss with respect to my actions. So I search for the loss here in this column that is associated with the smallest loss, and I read off the kind of the row number, the action that is associated with it. Right. That's the way to choose actions. Right. If only things were that simple. There's many reasons why things are not so simple. There's not many reasons. There's 2 reasons. The only 2 reasons why life is slightly more complicated than a big lookup table. One of the reasons I will discuss today. The other reason is someone going to teach about reinforcement learning?
Yes. At the end of the course.
So the other reason you will hear about at the end of the course. Okay? I can give you a preview. But we will really be discussing one reason here. And that reason, as you can already probably expect from the previous slide, is that we don't know for sure what is the state of the world, right? We have a probability distribution over it. And obviously, for different states of the world might be associated with different best actions. So how do we choose which action to execute if we are unsure about the state of the world to begin with? And so that's exactly what Bayesian decision theory is concerned with. And it says that, well, on average, by definition, you will do best if you minimize your expected loss, right? So what's your expected loss? You look at your posterior distribution that you inferred in the previous slide over hidden variables. For each setting of the hidden variables, and for each action, you look up the associated cost. Right now we are considering a single action. For all possible states of the world, you see what would be the cost associated with that action. And then you average these losses commensurate with the posterior probability of those states of the world. And that's your average cost associated with that action, given your current inferences about the world. And then you can choose the action which minimizes your expected loss. So that's that. And so we have solved problem number 1. Problem number 2 turns out to be slightly more difficult to solve, and that's pretty much why we have complicated brains. And that's the reason that, and the challenge number 2, which you will hear the solution of, or at least approximate solutions of, at the end of the course, is that our actions don't only influence the current losses that we have, but also influence future losses that we might have. And so we really need to solve something that is called a sequential decision-making task, not a one-step decision-making task, right? So all of Bayesian decision theory is about one-step decision-making tasks. And once you consider the point that when you make a decision to, for example, enroll this course, that's a small cost for you because you have to write an application and all that. But then it will have longer-term repercussions, right? You might have a longer-term loss or a longer-term reward, depending on how you look at it. But you need to make your decision now at the time of application, considering those long-term costs and benefits, right? And so that's why life is really so complicated, because life is kind of sequential decision-making under uncertainty and risk. And here we are only considering the uncertainty and risk aspect of it and not the sequential decision-making aspect of it. And reinforcement learning is all about mostly the sequential aspect and also the combination of the two. Okay, there was a question.
Yeah, just to make sure I understand. So, say you have several probabilities and you have the BS1, and you find the action with the lowest loss function, but then you might not necessarily choose this action because if for the second probability it has a very big loss function, it might cancel that out.
Exactly.
That's why you need to take into account both.
The full probability distribution. That's right. Yeah. Okay. So according to Bayesian decision theory, we choose the action that has the lowest expected loss. Is the notation here fine with everyone? Sums and argmin? Anyone who has a problem with that? Okay. Which one? Do you know this symbol here? Yep. The argmin. Okay. Argmin says argmin over A means that you evaluate this expression over all possible values of A, and the output of argmin is the A that minimizes this expression as a function of A. So it's different from just writing min. Min A would give you the value of this expression, the lowest possible value of this expression as you go through all possible values of A, right? So in other words, here is a function, which is a function of A. This is A. We have a function of A, okay? And you can consider this as just a function of A because we are integrating out Y or summing out Y. So in the end, this expression is just a function of A and X, by the way. But X is given to us. We can't optimize over it. That's what the world gives to us, right? And so I should have. Okay, I was preparing for maximization, but now I'm going to do minimization here. I'm not that Hungarian anymore, apparently. So this value here is min A FA, right? The value that the function takes at its lowest point. And the value of A at which it takes it, that's argmin A, FA. Does that make sense? Cool. Okay. Now, notice that this is a very general theory. So I deliberately gave you the example of going out either one of the two doors because there, the state of the world can be a very high-dimensional object, right? Whether there is a fire, where that fire is exactly in the building, how many people are still in the room, which way they are moving. That's a complicated object. And I might have some uncertainty about it, right? Because some of that is not directly observable to me. And so in that case, that's my Y, the state of the world. And I have a posterior distribution over the state of the world. My action is whether I should leave through door number one, or door number 2. And so mathematically, the space of actions has nothing to do with the space of possible, the space of the states of the world, right? One is where is the fire in the building. The other is door number 1 or door number 2. But we can consider a special case when A and Y happen to be in the same space. So for example, I'm an animal. You are an experimenter. You display a stimulus embedded in noise. The stimulus can be one of two stimuli. And my job is to estimate which stimulus you're showing and respond correspondingly by, nose poking in port number 1 or port number 2. In that case, my actions are binary. The stimulus is binary. You're either showing stimulus A or B. And so mathematically, they are in the same space, right? Both is a binary number. It could be continuous. You're showing me an orientation, and I need to guess what is exactly that orientation. And again, my action is choosing an orientation. So by definition, my action is in the same space as the space you define as the experimenter to be the relevant space of the stimulus. Really, the stimulus is a high-dimensional object because it's a kind of a bunch of pixels on a screen. But for all practical purposes, it's in the same space because you define the stimulus by varying an orientation, by controlling an orientation variable. So as a special case of the general framework of Bayesian decision theory, we can consider the case when y and they happen to be in the same space. And yeah?
So this LAY is thought to be the same difficulty of computing.
Sorry,
Like,
what's considered?
so I'm not sure why.
So L is a function of two variables. And the assumption here is that if you give me an action and the state of the world, I can immediately give you the associated loss. But the action might be door 1, door 2, and the state of the world might be fire in room 1, fire in room 2, fire in room 3, fire in room 4, and that combined with people are running downstairs or people are running upstairs. So that there's a lot of different states of the world. My action can only be 2. So in that case, this big lookup table would look like it would have 2 rows associated with the 2 actions and a lot of columns corresponding to all the possible states that the world can be in. And I can just, using this lookup table, I can just read out the loss associated with any combination of the state of the world and my action.
So my question is, so each value is kind of similarly easy to compute?
Yes. Right now we are not concerned about how easy it is to compute L. We assume that L is given.
Because I'm not sure why there should be some over y.
Because that's our expected loss, right? The mathematical notion of expectation requires you to go over all possible values that a random variable can take and compute some function of that random variable, in this case y, and take a weighted sum of those. Because that's if I repeat, the meaning of this quantity is that if I see x, as long as my internal model is well calibrated, so the probabilities that go into the likelihood and the prior that go into my internal model are the true probabilities that the world really uses to generate the hidden variables and to generate the observations based on the hidden variables. So as long as my probabilistic internal model is well calibrated, then essentially this quantity tells me that if I see x and execute action A and I repeat it many times, what will be the average loss that I will see? Okay, that's what this is. It's the average loss. Every time there is a particular setting of x that I observe, if I execute action A, what is the average? If I repeat it many, many, many times, what will be the average loss that I suffer? And so, rather than having to repeat it many times, even on a single occasion, I can compute what would be the expected loss, right? And that's what it is. That's why we are taking an average. And an average, this is an average. This is not a sum, technically, right? Because there is this term here. And these you can think about it as a weighted average, where the weights are the posterior probabilities, and the posterior probabilities, by definition, sum to 1. So it's a proper weighted average, because the weighting factors sum to 1. They are all non-negative and sum to 1, as probabilities go.
So in the actual case, maybe there's also like how long does it take to make a decision is also kind of loss included.
Oh, okay. So that's a very interesting question. So if we want to figure the cost of decision making itself into this framework, that's a very interesting direction to go, and I'm going to ignore that altogether. But it's yeah.
As like in your example, then maybe going from that door or going from this door, then there's
Okay, but that's just in the loss. I think that's nothing extra. I think what you want to say, if I can guess, is that thinking through the consequences of different actions itself might incur different costs. You know, one might take longer, one might take shorter, right? If you're playing chess, the outcomes of some moves are pretty obvious, and the outcomes of other moves require to think more about them, right? So it's in the realm of what is called metacognition, when I'm trying to reason about what kind of cognitive operations to perform in the first place. Whether it's worth for me to think more about this problem, whether it's worth for me to consider more actions, or I should just not consider all of them. But that's something I'm not going to consider here. There are theories, there are ways to include those kind of considerations into Bayesian decision theory and even in reinforcement learning, but I'm not going to talk about them now.
Because perception should be like very happen soon, so I'm
Yeah.
not sure whether you're thinking of all sum or just taking the maximum.
Okay, so here, right now, this is not perception, this is math, right? This is the right thing to do. And then we can see how close perception comes to this in different cases. This just tells you that in principle, this is how you should be doing things. Okay? It's useful to have a yardstick. Okay, so we are considering the special case when A and Y live in the same space. So A can be essentially considered an estimate of Y, right? So Y, I will call it Y hat. Yeah, a brief one.
Yeah. What will happen if you get a value of Y which is not on your table? You extrapolate between the two closest values?
Yeah, so in principle, this requires you to be able to assign a probability to any possible setting of Y, right? So a big question, indeed, is how you generalize to Ys. First of all, the Ys, by definition in this framework, you never observe directly. And you know how you generalize to parts of this table that you never experienced and things like that. But right now, I'm not, that's beyond the scope of this talk here. Okay, so the special case when these two quantities live in the same mathematical space is estimation. And so there's a few kind of loss functions that people use most of the time. And so it's worth looking at them more closely. So one loss function, right? So now my A has become Y hat, an estimate of Y, is the squared loss. I'm sure all of you have seen this before, squared loss. And it turns out that once I know what my loss function is, that gives me a unique way to go from an inference to a single point estimate. Just like here, it gave me a direct way to go from a full probability distribution, right? Notice that we started with a full probability distribution, and in the end, we arrive at a single action. Here, we are arriving at a single estimate, because if this is the loss function, then the best estimate that will minimize my squared loss is the posterior mean. And this is actually an exercise that is within the exercises I gave you to prove this, right? So I'm not going to prove it for you now. It's pretty straightforward to prove that in case you care about the squared loss, the way you go from the full posterior distribution to a single point estimate is that you take the mean of that posterior distribution. If the loss function is the absolute value, then what do you think will be the optimal point estimate? So I have a probability distribution. So I'm going to rename this as P of Y, given X. Here's my probability distribution. Which point along the y-axis should I pick if my loss is an absolute valued loss? Anybody can guess? So it turns out that I need to choose the median, right? So the value of y, where I am splitting the probability mass into two. So I don't know, maybe depending on how long this goes on, such that the probability mass here and the probability mass here is the same. That's the median in that case, right? And so this is a pretty clumsy mathematical notation, but that's the best I could come up with. But importantly, the posterior median and the posterior mean are not the same usually. They are the same in some few special cases, but in general they are not. And finally, a loss function, just a second. Finally, a loss function that comes up a lot in behavioral tasks is the all or none loss function. It essentially says that we don't care how much off you were with your estimate. you will get exactly the same loss all the time, except if you are spot on, in which case you don't have a loss, right? But other than that, we don't care. So that's what this expresses. And in that case, the optimal point estimate is the mode of the distribution. So in other words, what is also known as the maximum a posteriori estimate. So that's argmax, by the way. That's the value of y that maximizes p of y given x. There was a question there.
Where does L live?
L is a scalar, is a real scalar.
Okay. So if you...
I mean, in principle, for this, it doesn't need to be real. It could be discrete, but
but it's just, I mean,
it's a scalar. Right? Yeah, it definitely has to be a scalar.
If you use like something, if y is a vector, wouldn't you use something like I don't know, norm squared, full squared?
Yeah, so here I'm considering y to be scalar too, but it could be a vector. You're true. You're right, and then it would be just a norm, the squared norm. Yeah. So yeah, in this case, this is the 1 norm. This is the 2 norm. Yeah, I'm going to make a break here, I think. So this was the kind of the mathematical introduction, and now after this we'll kind of. So far this was all math, no cognition, let alone neuroscience. But now we have all the mathematical tools, and then we will apply it to very different domains of cognition to see how the same principles can be used to understand very different phenomena. Let's make a 5-minute break. So now I'm just going to go through very different, kind of on purpose, through very different examples where my goal is to demonstrate that it's exactly the same principles that can be understood that can be used to understood behavior. And so the first example is the so-called Knitter triangle. I assume most of you have seen this stimulus. The point here is that we see a triangle here, even though, strictly speaking, there is no triangle there because there is no 3 points connected by lines there. But we perceive the stimulus as if there was kind of a triangle occluding these 3 circular disks and this triangle underneath. And so, why do we see it that way? And so it turns out that we can understand this as if our perceptual system was doing filling in a way that is commensurate with the statistical properties of the world. And so this is work by Bill Geisler and colleagues, where what they did, I don't know how much you can see it, they took pictures of the natural environment. So this picture has been taken in the woods. There's a lot of twigs and branches and leaves there. And each image they analyzed such that they extracted small line segments from many small line segments from each image. And they decided whether 2 line segments at some spatial configuration, some distance, relative angle, and so on, are actually related to the same objects, such as the same branch, or not. And so this is how they parameterize the spatial configuration of these small line segments. So every little, what you probably can't see here is that this picture is a grayscale image of a photograph. And then there's little red line segments overlaid on top. And the little red line segments, they analyzed pairs of these line segments. They were in some spatial configuration, parameterized by these 3 variables, their distance, relative angle, and so forth. And then decided whether that particular pair of line segments belong to the same contour line, such as the same branch of the tree, or not. Okay? And so they just collected a lot of data of this sort. And in the end, one of the things that they plotted is the so-called likelihood ratio, which is what is the probability that 2 line segments are in a particular spatial configuration, d phi theta, given that they do or don't belong to the same contour, the same actual physical contour. And what's the kind of the ratio of these 2 probabilities, which is what is called the likelihood ratio. Okay. And so here they are plotting this quantity parametrically as a function of d, phi, and theta. So d is the radius of these circles. Phi varies from here around the circle, and theta varies within these little circles here. And so not surprisingly, what you see here is that line segments that are roughly co-aligned and are near spatially tend to belong to the same contour line, because then this color scale is above green, whereas line segments that are further apart and have a larger angle between them tend to belong to different contour lines. Okay, that's roughly the bottom line. And so that kind of gives you a normative explanation that if we are using our knowledge of the statistical properties of the world, then indeed these two line segments, for example, are relatively close and they are co-aligned. So it makes sense to think that they belong to the same contour line, even if we don't see them being connected. And the same about this line segment here and that line segment there. Here's something, so that was perception. This is now motor control from Daniel Wolpert's lab. And here, so we went all the way from perception to action, as you can see. And here, the task was the following. Subjects had to make a reaching movement in a way that they couldn't see their own hands. Instead, what they could see is in a virtual reality, they saw a cursor that was meant to show where their hand was. And so they had to go from a starting position to a target position here. And rather than seeing their hand, they only saw this cursor that was supposed to indicate when their hand was. But really what happened is that from trial to trial, there was a random offset that was between the true position of the hand and where the cursor showed where the hand was, right? And importantly, the goal of the task was to make sure that the cursor reaches the target, right? And so, but from time to every trial, there was a random offset between the true position and the actual position. And on some trial, and importantly, they only saw feedback about where the cursor was halfway through the trial. As they were reaching halfway, they saw feedback. And the reliability of that feedback was varied trial to trial. And so, for example, on this trial, for example, the lateral shift would be 2 centimeters. Here's the true trajectory of the hand. But because on that trial, the lateral shift, the offset of the cursor was 2 centimeters, what they would see is this cursor path, except that they don't see the full path. They only see it halfway through the trial. So here, for example, this is where they receive feedback. Okay? And the task is to make sure that that the cursor reaches the target. So for example, you would be doing this trajectory. You realize that there is this lateral shift. So you change your trajectory and veer to the left, right? So that the cursor gets to the target at the end. Okay. So they trained people on this task a lot. And in particular, the way they trained them is that the lateral shift was drawn from a distribution, a prior, that was a Gaussian centered on 1 centimeter and with a standard deviation of 0.5. So this was the true distribution from which these lateral shifts came, and they trained people on it so that they could assume that people kind of internalize this prior distribution. They know that this is the distribution from which lateral shifts are drawn, right? So this is a Bayesian estimation task. Because I don't know what is a true lateral shift. I have some prior knowledge about what it might be, what's the distribution from which it is coming. I make one observation, right, halfway through the trial. That observation is not perfect. It's not exactly reliable, and you'll see how they make it unreliable to different degrees. And I need to make an estimate in order to know how I should change the trajectory of my finger in order to get to the target, right? Classical Bayesian decision theory, Bayesian inference and decision theory problem. Okay, so these are speeded movements. Yeah.
So the cursor appears and then it disappears immediately after that.
Yeah.
Or it stays until the end of the trial?
No.
It disappears.
Yeah, but it doesn't really matter because again, the whole thing is over so quickly that you can't stop and think about it. But it just appears and then disappears. Okay. Now, what they vary, as I said, is the reliability of the feedback. Sometimes, so the subjects see a cloud of dots. Sometimes the cloud of dots is concentrated in a single position, the true position of the cursor. And then they add different amounts of noise, and there are kind of infinite noise trials when they just don't give any feedback, right? That's as if there was infinite noise in the feedback. So that's the likelihood. So imagine that on this trial, the true offset is the true shift is 2 centimeters. Then the likelihood that you need to consider across these conditions will differ in the width, right? And also, by the way, it's slightly misleading because the mean might not might also not be exactly on 2, but that's a detail. We can discuss it later. Okay, and so now if you're Bayesian, you multiply the prior with the likelihood, right? And importantly, the result of that is that the narrower the likelihood, the resulting distribution, these are all Gaussians for simplicity, the resulting distribution will also be Gaussian. Homework exercise for you if you want. It's not among the set exercises, but it's fairly easy to show that the product of two Gaussians is a Gaussian once you renormalize or normalize the product, which is what we do with Bayes' rule. And the narrower the likelihood, the narrower the posterior is going to be. And importantly, the narrower the likelihood, the closer the mean of the posterior is going to be to the mean of the likelihood. Or in other words, the broader the likelihood, so the more noise I have here, the more I will rely on my prior, right? And so the more this Gaussian, the closer this Gaussian will be to the original prior, right? And obviously with infinite noise, my posterior will just be my prior because I have no extra information on top of what my prior is telling me. Okay? So far so good. But of course, people in the end don't give us a full distribution. They just give us a single end position. So we need to make this additional assumption about what is the loss that they care about. And for simplicity, and in any case with Gaussians, almost any sensible loss function gives you the same estimator because their mean, mode, and median are all the same. So we can assume here that, for example, it's squared loss. Okay? And so what they looked at is, so this is just one assumption that people are kind of Bayes optimal in this sense, just as we saw it, do Bayesian inference, and then combine it with the loss function according to Bayesian decision theory. They could follow other strategies, which I'm not going to explain. You can look at the paper if you're interested in. Other strategies that might be sensible and strategies that people had proposed previously. And what they look at is what are the predictions of those strategies versus kind of the Bayesian strategy here. And in particular, the Bayesian strategy that takes into account the prior. And so there's another strategy called full compensation where you just follow what your input is telling you. There is another strategy which is called the feedback to estimate mapping where you just learn a mapping between feedbacks and and how much you should compensate for across trials. And then there is the Bayesian strategy. And what you see here is the true lateral, the deviation at the end of the trial, the deviation from the target, which you would like to keep small, right? Because you want to be on target as much as you can, as a function of the true lateral shift in the three conditions, on average, and also at least in one of the conditions, the green condition, the standard deviation around that, right? So you see that here, you are, on average, you're always right, right? So that looks like a good strategy. Here, you are in the condition doesn't matter because you just learned a feedback strategy here. And here, the strategy matters, and you're off, on average, you're off from 0 to different degrees, right? So this is, again, a homework exercise for you, an extra one. Why could it be that even though, on average, you are always right here, and you are barely ever right here, in what sense can we say that this is a better strategy than that? Right? At first, this should seem counterintuitive. Why is a strategy that is barely ever right, exactly, better than a strategy that is always right on average? But for now, just believe that indeed this is a better strategy, and that's the only strategy that takes into account the prior, and that so these are still just predictions, and now this is what humans did. And the important thing here is that indeed the slope of this curve that relates the deviation from the target to the true lateral shift changed across conditions, just as this strategy would have predicted. And it even worked with bimodal priors. So a bimodal prior would predict a strange kind of curve here, and by and large, humans were showing the same kind of deviations. Okay. Change of gears, once again, very different domain. Okay, a very highly cognitive task. You meet someone, so here's a task. You meet someone who is T years old. How long will they live for? What's going to be their total lifespan?
Conditional on that you met them? Or
yeah, condition that the only thing you know is that at the time at which you met them, they were T years old. How long will they live for, right? So all what you know, strictly speaking, the only thing you know that they will live at least t years because they're already t years old. But you know, how can we reason about this? And it turns out that humans show very consistent patterns of how they solve these kind of tasks. And this can be generalized to many other things, such as a cake has been in the oven for some time. What's the total baking time for that cake? Or a friend of yours cites their favorite line from their favorite poem. The line is the 10th line of the poem. How long is the poem altogether, right? So all these have exactly the same flavor, right? Obviously. So if you're Bayesian, how do you solve this task? Well, obviously you don't know for sure. So the right thing to do is to express a probability distribution over all possible total ages, given this only observation, right? That's your only observation, okay? So we just write down Bayes' rule and forget about normalization because it isn't really interesting at the moment. So importantly, you have two pieces of information as ever, a prior and the likelihood, right? So what's the likelihood? We will make the simplest possible assumption about the likelihood is that given a total life, right? So this says that if someone lives for so many years, at which time will you meet them, right? And we will just assume that it's uniform. You have equal chance during their lifespan. You obviously can't meet them once they are dead, hopefully. But within their lifespan, you have uniform probability to meet them at any age, okay? So that's uniform. That's it, okay? How about this? Now, this is interesting, right? Because this is where your domain knowledge comes in. You know that people don't live for 1,000 years. And you know that, at least in Western cultures, most people live longer than, thankfully, longer than a few years, right? So there's a typical age distribution in our population. And the same goes for poems, the same goes for bakes, box office grosses, and so on. So this is our prior knowledge. And so now, but of course, the task requires you to make a single estimate. So again, we need to bring in Bayesian decision theory. And for a change, we are going to consider a different loss function, which is going to be the absolute value loss function, so that we assume that people actually report the median of their posterior rather than the mean. Okay. And so this is just some qualitative exploration that, importantly, so if you plot t total as a function of t, which is exactly what the task is about, right? You can make qualitatively different predictions depending on what kind of prior you're assuming, whether it's a Gaussian, a power law, or something that is called an Erlang prior. So qualitatively different priors will show up as qualitatively different prediction curves in this t total versus t space, right? So if we can measure this, that should give us information about the underlying priors that people have, okay? And so that's what they did, Griffiths and Tenenbaum. So these are the actual distributions that can be measured in real life. And these are the predictions that people make. The dots are the actual data they collected from people estimates. And the lines is what the Bayes optimal estimate would be based on the true prior out in the world. Okay? So if people use the true prior distribution, that reflects the statistical properties of the world, so the true age distribution of the population, the true time for which movies run in the cinemas, the true amount, the true distribution of grosses that they make at the box office, and so forth and so on, then these are the predictions they should be making. Those are the lines, and the dots are the predictions that they actually make. And you can see that these are very different distributions, and for each people do a reasonably good job at using them to solve this task. And there's a few interesting details here which I'm not going to go into. But that's kind of the overall flavor of this. Okay, any questions? Okay, so another shift of gears. So this is actually our own work. So all the previous work that I showed you, and indeed most of the work in the field, assumes that people know the right, people's internal models are reasonably well calibrated. So for a prior, they use the true distribution with which things appear in the world. But maybe we don't want to make that assumption, and maybe it's not even, maybe there's no reason to believe that is true. So what do we know? So what do we do if we can't assume that people are adapted to natural statistics? How do we measure what people's priors really are without assuming that they are veridical. And so we set out on this task and realized that there's only a handful of cases when people try to actually measure priors rather than make strong assumptions about them. And I'm not going to go through all these examples. Again, they are from quite different domains. People have measured the prior that people have on the speed of visual motion from Eero Simoncelli's group. Daniel Wolpert's group looked at priors that people have on visual motor transformations. This is the direction of light prior that we actually use to solve the bubble versus dimple stimulus, where we have a strong prior assumption that that light is from above, right? Because in natural surroundings, that's usually the case. So people have actually tried to measure what exactly that prior looks like, and so forth and so on. This is actually a really cool example when people try to measure priors in a very clever way. But all these previous attempts had to us some serious shortcomings. First of all, many of them pooled the data across subjects, so they couldn't estimate priors subject by subject, which is a problem because, and again, you're implicitly making the assumption that all subjects will have the same prior. They were constrained to simple scalar measures, such as the speed of visual motion, so they couldn't be applied to kind of measure high-dimensional structured priors. Most of them worked with kind of simple, very low-level psychophysical variables and tasks only. So we don't know much about priors for higher level cognition. And most importantly, almost all of them were limited to using a single task. So they use a single task to measure people's prior. Why is that a problem? It's a problem in a technical and in a deeper conceptual sense. It's a problem in a technical sense because really a prior, if you're fitting it, is just a bunch of free parameters. And so you can say that, well, given this prior, people are Bayes optimal. But that's not saying much, right? Because your prior is a bunch of free parameters. And as we know from John von Neumann, with 4 parameters, I can fit an elephant and make it wiggle its tail, right? So with enough parameters, you can fit any kind of strange-looking behavior and claim that, well, it's Bayes optimal exactly given this strange-looking prior, right? So aren't we just overfitting then? So that's kind of the technical problem. The conceptual problem is that in some sense, the whole tenet of Bayesian decision theory is that it has this decoupling between the way you are making inferences and the way you go from the inferences from decisions or actions, right? That's, you first make the inference, and then given a loss function, using the same inference machine, you can combine it with different loss functions and therefore behave according to different tasks, where the task essentially defines your loss function, right? But as long, and the whole power of a Bayesian inference machine, if we are such Bayesian inference machines, is that we can use the same inference procedure and apply it in very different tasks. And that allows us to kind of generalize across different tasks in very powerful ways, which is obviously a good thing to be able to do. And indeed, humans show very strong forms of generalization. So if all is well, then what we should see is that people use the same inference machine, and in particular, they use the same priors in different tasks. But how do we know that as long as we are only measuring priors in a single task at a time? So we said that, well, the solution to both of these problems is to measure priors in 2 different tasks independently. And if we get the same prior in the 2 tasks, that, first of all, tells us that we are probably not overfitting, and we can be more quantitative about kind of assuring ourselves that we are indeed not overfitting the data using something known as cross-validation. And 2, it really shows that people are indeed using the same prior in different tasks. And that's a good thing. So this way of measuring priors, we coined it cognitive tomography, because it essentially uses a number of very simple measurements to reconstruct a complex high-dimensional object, which is the prior distribution. And it starts with something that is very well known in psychophysics as the ideal observer model, which is essentially all what I've been telling you about so far. Ideal observer models are, most of the time they are essentially these Bayesian inference machines that take some input, combine it with some prior, and emit responses according to Bayesian decision theory. So you have some internal prior distribution P as a subject. You see some stimuli. And at the end, you emit some responses. And you do that by inferring probabilities over hypotheses. And then given those hypotheses and the loss function, you emit responses. So that's everything that I've been telling you about so far. This is Bayesian inference, and this is Bayesian decision theory. Okay? And our model of how people work, according to Bayesian inference and Bayesian decision theory, is sometimes called an ideal observer model. And we can make it not so ideal or quasi-ideal by introducing kind of all sorts of suboptimalities, biases and perceptual noise, motor noise, and so forth. And we can parameterize all that. Okay. So essentially, all what cognitive tomography is to turning it upside down and saying that, well, not only we will assume that people are Bayesian, or at least approximately Bayesian, we, as the researchers, are also going to be Bayesian. And because really it's a Bayesian inference problem, right? All what we do is we observe stimuli and responses, and we want to infer the underlying prior, right? It's a Bayesian inference problem. And we don't know for sure what it is. We have observations. We want to go from observations to hidden variables, the prior of the subject. And so that's what cognitive tomography is. It's inverting the ideal observer model. Again, there's some technical subtleties here, which I'm not going to go into, but that's kind of the upshot. And so we used the same principle, and so we kind of asked subjects to do the same task over many, many, many trials, right? So in each trial, we get a little bit of information about the prior, and if we are doing Bayesian inference, according to the laws of probability, that will assure that we are accumulating information across these trials in an optimal way so that our posterior over the prior of the subject is getting tighter over time as we make more observations in more trials. So that's exactly what we do. So the two tasks that we used was a familiarity task where they saw two faces rendered, kind of 3D rendered faces, and I'm going to skip how we generate these faces. It's not even our work really, the way the faces are generated. They are parameterized with two variables for simplicity. So it's a two-dimensional feature space that we use to describe these faces. Okay? And they have to say which one looks more familiar to them, right? And the other task is an odd one out task. They see three faces and they have to say which one is the odd one out. So which one is most dissimilar from the other two. So these are the two tasks. It's a difficult task, and people report that they don't really know what they are doing, but it turns out that they do it quite consistently. And in an informative way, we have quantitative evidence for that. I'll show you that.
It's not like you're assuming that the prior is stable over all the time.
Yes, we are assuming, and that's a very good question. In fact, I just got a grant in which I want to get away from that assumption and try to see how priors change over time. But it turns out to be a technically very challenging question. Okay, if you're interested, we can think about the ideal observer models for these tasks. Actually, one of them, the more difficult one, is among the exercises for you. So here's what we get. So we run this Bayesian inference machine, cognitive tomography, and here's one prior distribution in this two-dimensional feature space in which we describe faces that we get for one of the subjects in one of the tasks. Here is another subject in the same task. So the first thing that you notice is that these are very structured distributions, at least some of them, right? So multimodal, they have long tails in different directions and all that. The second is they are very different across subjects. So it would have been a mistake to try to pull data across subjects because that would have assumed that they have the same prior, across, but they don't, right? Now we can also compare how the way things look across different tasks within the same subject, right? So we run this estimation or inference algorithm independently in the two tasks, completely independently, right? So these are two completely different data sets even for the same subject, and we don't mix them. And this is what we get, okay? So here's your color scale for the probabilities. And so what you see here is that actually, given the differences across subjects, the differences across tasks are much, much smaller. So they actually look surprisingly similar across tasks, right? So these are two completely different tasks. They're not the same, and obviously some of them is just probably measurement error, but they're surprisingly similar. And then we do it over 10 different subjects, right? So the same subject across two tasks. And what you see here is that going from the top to the bottom, it gets worse and worse. But I can tell you why that is. Because we have a completely model-independent way to measure how reliably people respond in general, because some of the trials we actually repeated exactly. And we can just measure how much they gave the same response to the same stimuli, right? If they don't give the same response to the same stimuli, then obviously we have no hope of recovering anything because they're just too noisy. So essentially what we have done here is that we have ordered subjects from top to bottom as the most and the least reliably responding subject, right? And that does not rely on any model of their behavior. It just measures how many times out of 100 trials they responded the same to the same stimuli, right? It's a completely model-independent way of measuring their reliability. So here, the priors look very different, but that's probably because those subjects are just, just didn't care about the tasks, or they responded very unreliably. For the reliably responding subjects, these priors, I would say, are impressively similar across tasks, but very different across subjects.
Yeah, sorry, but I mean, you got two distributions out of this experiment.
Mm-hmm.
Why can you compare them anyway? Because I don't understand. I mean, I'm not
because it's in the same feature space. It's your prior over human faces. So they are defined.
How did you do it? You ordered the faces in a
So the faces are parameterized in this two-dimensional feature space, and I can describe you later how exactly we created that feature space. But essentially, we can point to any point in this space and generate a face from there, right? Okay. So we showed a bunch of faces in those tasks. Yeah. So that's why they're comparable. Oh, yeah. It's the same feature space. Time is up.
Oh, pity. How do you make sure that the prior had learned in the first task?
Because, well, first of all, because we make sure that they are not learned in any of the tasks in a very simple way, because we show faces from the same distribution across subjects, and yet they have very different priors. So if they learned that distribution that we showed them, they would all have the same priors, but they don't. And we might have even counterbalanced. No, we didn't counterbalance the order for a good reason that I can tell you later, but yeah. Any other question? Okay, so we can measure Jensen-Shannon divergences, and that's all fine and good. But I think more important, and I think it really helps to be very hard-nosed about this and kind of just very down to earth and say that, well, and this is actually something that I will challenge most people in this field, when people kind of infer interesting internal representations. One thing that you see very, very rarely, and I think we should see much more of, is something that is bread and butter for statisticians and machine learning people, cross-validation. Fine, you claim that you discovered an interesting internal representation from observing behavior. Good. Now go and do cross-validation. What does that mean? You infer this internal representation from a subset of the trials, and you need to be able to predict behavior in the remainder of the trials, right? To me, that's not sufficient to prove that you're doing something sensible, but I think it's necessary. And you see very little of that in the field, interestingly. And I can give you specific examples when I think that was a real problem. So we did cross-validation, right? So what we did is that we took some of the trials, again, ran our inference machine, estimated the underlying prior based on those trials, and then predicted what people responded in the remainder of the trials, right? And this is cross-validation performance in the two tasks. Again, subjects are ordered from most reliable to least reliable. So we are way above chance, as you can see. Chance is 0.5 in one case and 1/3 in the other case, obviously. Although you can have a more sophisticated notion of chance as well.
They are ordered from reliable to non-reliable?
Most reliable to least reliable.
But the function is not.
Yeah, because it's not exactly monotonically decreasing. It's not measuring the same thing, right? One is a model-free way of measuring reliability. The other is how well we can predict their behavior. Okay. Now, the cool thing about having this model-free measure of reliability is that it can also be used to give us a theoretical upper bound on how we can at all hope to be able to predict their performance, right? If someone is very noisy, no model will be able to predict their behavior. If someone is super reliable, then in principle, you should be able to predict them all the time if you have the right model of their behavior. And you can actually kind of derive mathematically what's the best possible prediction performance you can have for a subject given the consistency in their responding. And if you do that, in both cases, you get a curve that looks something like this. That's the theoretical upper bound. And then so here's their consistency, their reliability, and here's how well you can hope to be able to predict them. And this is the edge of the gray area is that theoretical upper bound. And then on top of that, I'm plotting how well we are actually predicting them. And so what you can see here is that indeed we are predicting within error bars, we are predicting them as well as theoretically possible. Okay?
Even over for some such
Well, but that's error bars. I mean, yeah. Yeah, go ahead. There was a question there.
I wanted to ask about that bias because of the error bars.
Yeah. Because we measure reliability from a finite number of trials, and we measure our performance on a finite number of trials. So there is only sampling noise in that. Okay, so we are close to this theoretical upper bound in both cases. But the real proof of the pudding, right, is an even cooler form of cross-validation. Because now we can estimate the prior from one task and predict behavior in a completely different task, right? That's to us, that was the real test. And so here's our cross-validation performance on that. It's obviously not as good as within task cross-validation, but to us, it was still pretty damn good, right? So we are doing pretty well, in some cases as well as in within task prediction. Yeah, but again, that's probably just sampling noise. Okay, so here are the error bar. Here's pooling across subjects, and then we also ran a number of controls to see which pieces of the way we are doing this are important or not. It turns out that the structure, this odd idiosyncratic structure in the distributions, one could think that, well, that looks an awful lot like overfitting, right? The fact that we have these strange looking distributions. And indeed, I can give you references in the literature where I think what people report that look fancy looking distributions like this is indeed overfitting. So the way we wanted to test whether that was the case is that we moment matched each of our estimated distributions. So for each distribution, we substituted with a Gaussian, which had the same mean and the same covariance, so the same overall extent in all directions, even kind of the orientation of the covariance was the same, but didn't have any of the interesting higher order structure, right? And we asked, how well what's our cross-validation performance if we do that, right? So if the structural details are important, then we should be doing worse with the moment matched. And indeed, we do. The other thing, and we do in every single case. So these are individual subjects, moment-matched performance versus non-moment-matched performance in cross-validation, right? The other thing, this is kind of a deeper question, right? This is the old debate between cognitivism and behaviorism, right? Are animals stimulus-response machines, or do they have complex internal representations? So if animals are just simple stimulus-response machines, then I could take any off-the-shelf classifier that takes the stimuli that are animals called humans, so, and the responses they emitted, and just learn a direct mapping between the two, right? Or we can do what we do, which is assuming that they have these fancy-looking internal representations. And so the question is, which one does better? So we took kind of a cutting-edge classifier called the Gaussian process classifier, which, by the way, in the limit of infinite data should always do better than anything else, or it's a theoretical upper bound. But it's important that we have limited amounts of data. And it's with limited amounts of data where our prior assumption that people have complicated internal models becomes important. And so the question is, does a GP classifier do better than us? And obviously, a GP classifier has no chance of doing a cross-task cross-validation because it's fitted on each task, and there's no way of generalizing across tasks with it. And even within task, we are actually doing better, or at least marginally better, than the GP classifier. And again, this is showing subject by subject how much better we are doing. Okay, that's it. And I'm skipping yep, there's a question there.
Are there any rules or whatever to choosing the two behaviors that you use? So
the two tasks, you mean?
Yeah.
There's no formal rules. We chose two tasks that felt sufficiently dissimilar, and we kind of
Can they be too similar? In the sense, you could these be too similar?
Yeah, so that was a concern, and we had a way to show that they weren't, and I can tell you about that later if you're interested. We needed two tasks for which that felt sufficiently dissimilar, and both of which had an ideal observer model, or at least both of which we could at least construct an ideal observer model for. And this was the case. So, but in principle, you could use any two tasks for which you have ideal observer models that you can then invert, kind of putting them into this Bayesian inference machine, and that's fine. So for example, now we are generalizing it to a case when one of the tasks is not even a task when you make overt choices, it's a task in which you move your eyes. And we want to see whether whether A, we can recover priors just by tracking eye movements, and B, whether the priors that we recover are the same that we recover from an over-choice task. Yeah, time. Okay, I'm going to stop here. There's a lot of stuff I didn't talk about. Essentially, the thing I talked about is only so far is the first level of Bayesian inference. How do we go from observations to latent variables? And maybe how do we learn about the underlying parameters, such as Daniel Wolpert's experiment, that people learned the prior distribution of lateral shifts. But you can make this hierarchical. You can ask, how do we learn the right structure of the model? How do we learn the form of the structure of the model, and so forth and so on? And so let me give you one summary slide about the state of affairs in the field. Here we go. So Bayesian inference can be done in this hierarchical way. You can go from observations or data to latent variables y. You can apply the same Bayesian inference logic to infer underlying parameters of the world. You can use the same logic to infer the structure of the world and the form of the world. And those words have particular technical meanings, which I can explain if you're interested in. But the whole point is that it's increasingly kind of generic forms of learning that you can, inference learning that you can do. And all those require, in principle, all what they require is the application of Bayes' rule, which of course in any practical setting is intractable, so you need to be clever about how you do it, but that's a different matter. Now, on the side of cognitive science, we have theory for all of this, and the theory is Bayes' rule at all levels, and that's about it. I mean, you need to be a bit more sophisticated than that, but essentially, in some shape or form, it's doing approximate Bayesian inference at all these levels. That's the theory. And indeed, we have experimental evidence for most of these levels, right? That people really do these kind of sophisticated, approximately Bayesian stuff, Bayesian forms of inference at impressively high levels of generalization. And we even have some, at least partial evidence at this highest level of generalization. Now, if you go to neuroscience, and after all, this is a neuroscience school, right? Things look much more bleak. So we have, in fact, multiple competing theories about how this most basic level of Bayesian inference might be implemented in the brain. And I have a whole lecture about that, if you're interested, which I can give in the afternoon. We have some, but fewer theories about how this level might be implemented. And we essentially have no clue about all the other levels. In terms of experimental evidence, the experimental evidence, even at this level, is kind of sparse and contradictory. That level too, and then there is nothing much there. So you can, it's glass half full or half empty, right? So there's a lot of unknowns, and this can be discouraging, but I think you should take it as an encouragement. There's a lot of work for you guys to do. There's a lot of free space to fill in there. And so I would encourage you to kind of think about kind of how one might fill that space over there as you mature into full-grown computational neuroscientists. Thanks a lot.